If you hear the truth at the wrong table, you don't get to leave. You become part of it. The rain tapped steadily against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the restaurant, soft but relentless, like fingers reminding the city that night had its own rules. And inside, everything gleamed. Polished marble, crystal glasses, tailored suits that cost more than my rent for a year, but none of it felt real to me. Not when I was balancing a tray in my hands and pretending I didn't understand the quiet conversation happening just a few feet away in German, because I wasn't supposed to, because waitresses aren't supposed to listen, but I did, and that was the problem. I had grown up translating for my mother in grocery stores and clinics, learned early how a single word could shift meaning, could change everything, and tonight, that instinct, the one that never turned off, caught something wrong, something small but sharp, buried in a sentence that didn't match the tone of the room, a word that meant delivery, being turned into something softer, something safer, like inspection, and I felt it immediately. The way you feel when a step is missing on a staircase you've walked 100 times. My fingers tightened around the edge of the tray as I moved closer, pretending to refill water glasses, keeping my head down while my ears stayed open, and the translator, the man in the expensive suit with the practiced smile, spoke again, smooth and confident, but wrong, still wrong, twisting meaning just enough to hide something dangerous underneath. And the men at the table nodded like everything was normal. Like this was just another business deal, except it wasn't, and I knew it wasn't, and I didn't know how I knew, only that my chest felt tight and my pulse wouldn't slow down. Then the room shifted. It didn't happen loudly, no announcement, no grand entrance, just a subtle change in the air, like pressure dropping before a storm, and people straightened without realizing they were doing it. Conversations softened, eyes moved without turning heads, and I felt it before I saw him. Vincent Hale walked in like he owned the silence more than the space, like everything around him adjusted without being told, his suit dark, perfectly cut, his expression unreadable, and he didn't look at anyone directly, not at first, but somehow everyone felt seen anyway, including me, even though I kept my eyes down and stepped back into the role I was supposed to play. Background, invisible, safe. Except I wasn't safe anymore, because now I knew who the deal was for, and I knew the translation was wrong, and I knew that if I stayed quiet, something bad would happen to a man who didn't even know he was being misled, and that should have been none of my business. It should have been just another night, another shift, another table to serve and forget, but my heart didn't care about what was smart, only about what was right. And as Vincent took his seat, calm and controlled, listening to a version of the truth that wasn't real, I realized something I couldn't ignore. Sometimes the most dangerous thing in the room isn't the man with power. It's the lie standing right next to him, smiling, translating, waiting for the moment no one notices it's already too late. I should have walked away the moment I realized what was happening, but something about the way Vincent Hale sat there, calm and unaware, made my feet stay rooted to the marble floor like they had already chosen a side without asking me first. And I hated that feeling because it meant this was no longer just another shift, no longer just another table I could forget once the night ended. The translator continued speaking, his tone smooth, confident, the kind that made lies feel like facts, and I watched Vincent carefully, searching for any sign that he noticed the difference, any hesitation, any flicker of doubt. But there was nothing, just that steady stillness that made him feel untouchable, like a man who had built his life on control and did not expect it to slip in something as simple as a conversation. I moved closer again, slower this time, setting down a glass that did not need refilling, my hands steady on the outside even as my thoughts ran faster than I could keep up with, replaying the sentence in my head, translating it back and forth, checking myself because maybe I was wrong, maybe I had misunderstood, but the more I listened, the clearer it became, the mistake was not mine. It was deliberate. A quiet shift in meaning that turned a routine agreement into something else entirely, something that would put Vincent in a position he did not see coming. And the realization sat heavy in my chest, pressing down until breathing felt like work. One of the men across the table spoke again, his voice lower now, and I caught another phrase, another subtle twist, and that was when the fear changed into something sharper, something that refused to stay silent. Because this was no longer a misunderstanding. It was a setup, carefully dressed in polite language and expensive suits. I stepped back, heart pounding, and for a second I almost turned away, almost chose the safer version of the night where I finished my shift, collected my tips, and went home without ever knowing what happened after I left. But that version of me did not exist anymore, not after I heard what I had heard. The manager passed behind me and leaned in just enough for his voice to reach my ear without drawing attention, telling me to stay focused, to stop hovering, to remember my place, and I nodded automatically even though my mind was somewhere else entirely, caught between instinct and consequence. I looked at Vincent again, really looked this time, and there was something about the way he held himself, the quiet authority, the complete certainty in his control of the situation, that made the decision harder, not easier, because people like him did not expect help, and they definitely did not expect it from someone like me. The translator laughed softly at something one of the men said, and Vincent gave a small nod, a silent agreement to words that were not true, and that was it. That was the moment everything narrowed into a single point, because I understood then that if I said nothing, I would carry that silence with me long after this night ended, and it would not matter that I was just a waitress or that it was not my world, because I would still know that I had a chance to change something and chose not to. I set the tray down on the nearest empty surface without realizing I was doing it, my hands suddenly free, my pulse loud in my ears, and for a brief second the entire room seemed to slow, every movement stretching into something distant and unreal. As I took a step forward toward a table I had no right to approach like this, toward a man who did not know he needed to be warned, toward a line I could not uncross once I crossed it. And the only clear thought left in my mind was that sometimes staying silent is not safe, it is just another way of choosing a side. I did not remember deciding to speak. Only the moment my voice cut through the quiet like it did not belong to me, steady in a way I did not feel as the words left my mouth before I could stop them. Your translator is lying. For a second, nothing happened, and that silence felt heavier than any reaction I had imagined, like the entire room had paused just to see what would break first, me or the truth I had just thrown onto the table. Every sound seemed to disappear, the soft clink of glasses, the low hum of conversation, even the rain against the windows faded into something distant and unreal, and I felt every pair of eyes shift toward me without anyone turning their heads too quickly, because people in rooms like this knew how to watch without being obvious. I should have stepped back, should have apologized, should have pretended I had said something else, anything else, but my feet would not move and my chest would not loosen, and it was too late to take it back anyway. The translator was the first to react, his smile tightening just enough to reveal the crack beneath it, and he said something quickly in German, his tone sharper now, defensive, dismissive, like I was nothing more than a mistake that needed to be corrected, but I understood every word and none of them fixed what he had already done. One of the men at the table frowned slightly, confusion flickering across his face, while another leaned back, studying me with a kind of curiosity that made my skin feel too thin, like I had stepped into a place where I did not belong and everyone knew it except me. And then there was Vincent Hale. He did not raise his voice. He did not move right away. He just looked at me, and that look was worse than anger because it was too controlled, too deliberate, like he was measuring something I could not see, weighing my words against everything else in the room, deciding if I mattered enough to listen to or if I would disappear the moment he chose to ignore me. His gaze held mine for what felt like too long, and I felt it in a way that made it hard to breathe, not because it was cruel, but because it was precise, like he saw more than I was ready to show. Explain, he said finally, his voice low, even, not directed at me at first, but at the translator, who immediately began speaking again, smoother this time, more careful, but still wrong, still bending the meaning just enough to keep the lie intact. I swallowed, my throat dry, and forced myself to speak again, this time directly to Vincent, because if I was going to cross the line, I could not stand halfway on it. He changed the terms, I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could, even though my pulse was loud in my ears. What they are offering is not what he is telling you. The room did not explode the way I had feared. There were no raised voices, no sudden chaos. Just a shift, subtle but undeniable, like a current changing direction beneath the surface. Vincent's eyes flicked back to the translator, and something in his expression cooled further, not anger, not yet, but awareness, sharp and focused, and he lifted one hand slightly, a small gesture that somehow carried more authority than anything louder could have, and the translator stopped mid-sentence. "Translate it again," Vincent said, his tone unchanged, but this time there was no room for interpretation, no softness left in the words. The translator hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough for everyone at the table to notice, enough for the air to tighten again in a different way, and when he began speaking the second time, the difference was there, clear and undeniable, the meaning shifting back into something honest, something dangerous in its own right, and I saw it in the way the men across the table reacted, in the way their expressions hardened, in the way their confidence slipped just enough to expose what they had been trying to hide. Vincent did not look at me again right away, but I felt the change in the room as clearly as if it had been spoken out loud, because the moment the truth was said, everything else rearranged itself around it. Alliances, intentions, outcomes, all of it shifting because of a single sentence I should not have heard and a single choice I should not have made. And as I stood there, suddenly aware of how far I had stepped outside the life I understood, I realized something I could not undo. I had just interfered in a world that did not forgive interference, and whether Vincent Hale chose to thank me or not, I already belonged to the consequences of that decision. No one spoke right away, and that silence felt deliberate, like something Vincent Hale had allowed to stretch just long enough to remind everyone at the table who controlled when things moved and when they stopped, and I stood there caught inside it, aware that I had stepped too far to pretend I was invisible again, but not far enough to understand what came next. The translator shifted in his seat, his composure thinning in ways only someone watching closely would notice, and I realized that in a room built on power and precision, even the smallest hesitation carried weight. Even a single breath taken too late could say more than words ever could. Vincent leaned back slightly in his chair, not relaxed but calculated, his attention moving between the men across from him and the one beside him who had just rewritten their entire agreement with a few carefully chosen words, and then, slowly, he looked at me again. It was not curiosity this time, not even suspicion, it was recognition, as if he had already decided that what I had done mattered, and now he was determining exactly how much. "You understand German," he said, and it was not a question, just a statement placed into the space between us like something that could not be denied. My throat tightened, but I nodded anyway, because there was no point in pretending otherwise now. "Fluent," I answered, my voice quieter than before, but still steady enough to hold, and I felt every person at the table register that word in their own way, measuring it, recalculating what it meant for them and for me. "Translate," he said, and this time the word was directed at me. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him, because that was not something that should have been asked of me, not in this room, not at this table, not by someone like him. But the expectation in his voice left no space for refusal, and the absence of hesitation in his expression made it clear that he was not offering me a choice. He was giving me a role. My hands felt empty without the tray, my fingers curling slightly as if they were searching for something to hold on to. But there was nothing except the weight of what I had already done and the understanding that this was the point where it became something more. I took a small step closer, aware of how every movement was being watched, how every breath felt louder than it should, and I forced myself to focus on the words being spoken again, this time without the distortion, without the filter that had hidden their intent. And when I spoke, I made sure there was no room for interpretation, no softness that could be twisted into something else. The sentence landed differently when it was true, sharper, heavier, carrying a meaning that could not be disguised, and I saw it in the way the men across the table reacted, in the way their posture shifted, in the way their confidence adjusted to match the reality they could no longer avoid. Vincent listened without interrupting, his attention fixed, precise, and when I finished, the room felt different again, not tense in the same way as before but aligned, like everything had settled into its correct place whether anyone liked it or not. "We will proceed with the correct terms," he said, and there was no argument, no pushback, only the understanding that whatever had almost happened here had been stopped before it could begin. The men across from him exchanged brief glances, their earlier confidence replaced by something more careful, more measured, and I realized that the balance of the entire room had shifted in a way that could not be undone. I should have stepped back then, should have returned to the edges where I belonged, but I did not move, because Vincent had not dismissed me, and somehow that mattered more than anything else. His gaze returned to me one last time, and there was something new in it now, not gratitude, not exactly, but something closer to ownership of the situation itself, like he had already decided what my place in it would be even if I had not. "You will stay," he said quietly, and it was not framed as a request, not softened with explanation, just a simple statement that settled into the space between us with the same certainty as everything else he had said, and in that moment, I understood that speaking up had not just changed the outcome of a deal, it had changed the direction of my night, my role, and maybe something much bigger than I was ready to see, because the truth I had given him had come with a cost, and he had just decided I was going to be the one to pay it. The words settled over me heavier than anything else that had been said that night, not because they were loud or dramatic, but because they were final, and I realized that Vincent Hale did not repeat himself, did not negotiate in moments like this. He simply decided and expected the world to adjust accordingly, including me. I did not move right away, not because I was refusing, but because my body had not caught up to what had just happened, and for a second I was still standing there like I was just another server who had stepped too close to a table that was not hers, except I knew that version of the night was gone now. The manager appeared at my side almost instantly, his presence sharp with quiet panic as he tried to correct what he saw as a mistake, his hand hovering near my arm, as if he was deciding whether to pull me back himself or apologize on my behalf. But he stopped when Vincent shifted his gaze toward him, just slightly, just enough to make it clear that this was no longer something the restaurant could fix. "She stays," Vincent repeated, his tone calm, but leaving no room for interpretation, and the manager's expression tightened before he nodded quickly, stepping back like he had been reminded of boundaries he could not cross. I felt that shift again, the subtle reordering of the room, the way people adjusted to his words without needing them explained, and it made something inside me go very still, because this was not authority that needed to be proven, it was authority that simply existed. The conversation resumed, but it was not the same as before, the tone more careful, the words more precise, and I found myself listening again, not out of curiosity this time, but because I had been placed into the middle of it, expected to understand, expected to be part of it whether I wanted to or not. Vincent spoke less than anyone else at the table, but when he did, the others listened, and I began to understand the rhythm of it, the way he controlled the pace without raising his voice, the way decisions seemed to form around him rather than come from him directly. At one point, he asked a question in German, his accent controlled but not native, and when the translator hesitated before responding, Vincent's eyes flicked toward me instead, just for a second, and I felt that same unspoken expectation settle over me again, the one that did not ask if I was willing, only if I was capable. I answered before I could second-guess it, translating the response exactly as it was meant, not softened, not adjusted, and the moment I finished, Vincent gave the slightest nod, not acknowledging me openly, but not ignoring me either, and somehow that felt more significant than anything louder would have been. When it finally ended, the men across the table stood, their expressions composed again but different than when they had arrived, more measured, more aware, and they left with brief, respectful nods that felt like acknowledgments of a shift they could not undo. The room seemed to breathe again once they were gone, the tension easing just enough to remind me how tight it had been, and I realized then how still Vincent had remained through all of it, how controlled every moment had been, and how easily it could have gone differently if I had stayed silent. I took a small step back, instinct finally catching up with everything else, but before I could move any further, his voice stopped me again, quieter now, but no less certain. "You," he said, not needing to say my name because he did not need it to hold my attention, "come with me." And just like that, the night shifted again, pulling me away from the only world I understood and into one I had already stepped into without realizing there was no clear way back. I followed him before I had time to question it, not because I was told to in a way that forced me forward, but because something about the certainty in his voice made hesitation feel pointless, like resisting would only delay what was already decided, and that realization settled deeper than fear ever could. The dining room faded behind us as Vincent Hale moved without looking back, his pace unhurried but precise, and the space seemed to part for him effortlessly, staff stepping aside, conversations lowering without anyone being asked, and I felt it again, that quiet shift that happened around him, like the world adjusted its volume when he entered or left it. I stayed a few steps behind, close enough that I could hear the faint sound of his shoes against the polished floor, far enough that I was not intruding, though I was already far beyond any line I should have respected. We passed through a private corridor I had never been allowed to enter, the lighting softer here, the noise of the restaurant replaced by something more controlled, more contained, and I became sharply aware of how out of place I was, not just in position but in everything, my uniform, my presence, the fact that I had crossed into a part of the building meant for people who did not serve but were served. He stopped at a door without knocking, pushing it open with the same effortless authority he carried everywhere else, and I hesitated only for a fraction of a second before stepping inside after him. The quiet click of the door closing behind us, sealing off the rest of the world in a way that felt final. The room was not extravagant, not in the way the dining area had been, but it was precise, everything in its place, every detail intentional, from the dark wood desk to the low lighting that made the space feel smaller, more focused, and I realized this was not a place for show. It was a place for decisions. Vincent did not sit right away, instead turning slightly, his attention settling on me with a clarity that felt sharper without the distraction of an audience. And for the first time that night, there was nothing else pulling his focus away, no conversation, no negotiation, just me standing there in a room I had no business being in. "Your name," he said, and it was simple, direct, not softened with politeness or unnecessary words, just a request for information delivered like something he expected to receive. I swallowed, suddenly aware of how loud my own breathing sounded in the quiet space, and gave it to him, my voice steady enough to hold even as everything else felt unbalanced. He repeated it once, not as a question but as confirmation, as if placing it somewhere in his mind where it would not be lost, and then he nodded slightly, like that piece of information was enough to move forward. "How did you know?" he asked next, and this time there was something different beneath the calm, not doubt, not disbelief, but curiosity sharpened into something more precise, something that wanted an exact answer, not a vague one. I hesitated for a second, not because I did not know what to say, but because I understood that the way I answered mattered, not just the words themselves, but what they revealed about me, about why I had stepped in at all. "Because he changed one word," I said finally, keeping it simple, factual, because anything else would have sounded like an excuse, and I knew he was not interested in those. And that word changed everything. Vincent watched me as I spoke, not interrupting, not reacting immediately, just listening in a way that made it clear he was not only hearing the answer, but measuring it, testing it against everything else he knew. "Most people would not notice," he said after a moment, and there was no accusation in it, only observation, but it carried weight anyway, because it was not just about the language, it was about the choice I had made to act on it. I let out a slow breath, one I had not realized I was holding, and met his gaze more steadily this time, because if I was already here, there was no point in pretending to be smaller than I was. "Most people are not listening for the right reasons," I replied, and the moment the words left my mouth, I wondered if I had said too much, stepped too far again. But Vincent did not react the way I expected, did not shut it down or dismiss it. Instead, something in his expression shifted, just slightly, like he had found an answer he had not been looking for, but would not ignore. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, but it was not easy either. It stretched just long enough to make me aware of every second, every breath, every thought that tried to surface and was pushed back down, until finally he moved, stepping closer by a small, deliberate distance that made the space between us feel more defined rather than less. "You intervened in something that does not concern you," he said, his tone still even, still controlled, but there was something firmer beneath it now, something that acknowledged the risk without needing to explain it. "Do you understand that?" I nodded slowly, because I did, at least in the way someone understands the edge of something without knowing how deep it goes, and that was enough for now. He held my gaze for another second, then gave a slight nod of his own, like he had reached a conclusion I was not yet aware of, and when he spoke again, the words settled into place with the same quiet certainty as everything else he had said that night. "Then you understand why you are not leaving yet." The words stayed in the air long after he said them. Not heavy, not threatening in the way most people would expect, but firm in a way that made it clear there was no alternative hidden behind them, no softer interpretation waiting to be discovered if I looked hard enough. And I realized that Vincent Hale did not rely on force the way others might have. He relied on certainty, on the quiet understanding that once he made a decision, the outcome was already set in motion. I nodded again, slower this time, not out of submission but out of recognition, because I did understand, at least enough to know that leaving was no longer something I controlled, and strangely, that awareness steadied me more than it unsettled me, like my mind had stopped searching for exits and started focusing on what was directly in front of me. Vincent watched that shift happen. I could tell by the way his gaze narrowed slightly, not in suspicion but in assessment, like he was recalculating something based on how I reacted rather than what I said. And for a moment I wondered what he saw, not just a waitress who spoke up at the wrong time, but something else, something that made him decide I was worth keeping in the room a little longer. He moved then, not abruptly, just enough to break the stillness, stepping past me toward the desk and reaching for a glass of water that had been set there earlier, his movements precise, controlled, and I found myself watching him without meaning to, noticing the way nothing about him felt rushed, like time adjusted to him instead of the other way around. He took a small sip, then set the glass down without looking at it, his attention already back on me before the sound of it touching the surface had fully settled. "You made a choice," he said, and this time there was something different in his tone, not questioning, not challenging, just stating it for what it was, and I felt that same weight again, not of the words themselves but of what they implied. I exhaled quietly, my hands now resting at my sides instead of searching for something to hold on to, and met his gaze without looking away. "So did you?" I replied before I could stop myself, and for a split second I wondered if I had crossed another line I could not see. But Vincent did not react the way most people would have, did not shut it down or dismiss it. Instead, something in his expression shifted again, subtle but unmistakable, like he had not expected that answer and was deciding what to do with it. "Most people would have stayed quiet," he said after a moment, and there was no judgment in it, only observation, but it carried more weight than anything louder could have. I shrugged slightly, a small movement that felt almost out of place in a room like this, but it was honest. "Most people would not have understood what they were hearing," I answered, and that truth settled between us in a way that felt more solid than anything else that had been said so far. Vincent studied me for another second, his gaze steady, unhurried, and I realized that this was how he operated, not through intimidation or urgency, but through patience, through the ability to wait just long enough for the right detail to reveal itself. "And yet you did more than understand," he said quietly. "You acted." I did not respond right away, because there was no simple answer to that, no explanation that would make it sound reasonable or safe. So instead, I said the only thing that felt true. Someone had to. The words hung there, simple, unpolished, but real, and for the first time that night, something close to approval flickered in his expression, not obvious, not something anyone else would have noticed, but I did, because I had been watching him closely enough to recognize the smallest change. He turned slightly then, glancing toward the door as if considering something beyond the room, beyond me, and when he looked back, whatever decision he had reached was already settled. "You are not part of my world," he said, and the statement landed clearly, without insult, without dismissal, just fact. "But tonight, you stepped into it." I felt that again, that shift inside me, the recognition that this was no longer just about what had happened at the table, it was about what came after, about what it meant to be seen in a way I had not been before. Vincent took a step closer, not enough to invade my space, but enough to redefine it, his presence filling the room in a way that had nothing to do with size or proximity and everything to do with control. "That means two things," he continued, his voice low but steady. "You are now visible to people you were never meant to be visible to." A chill ran through me, not sharp, not overwhelming, just enough to remind me that there were consequences I had not fully considered, that the truth I had spoken had reached further than I could see. He paused for a fraction of a second, just long enough for that realization to settle, before finishing the thought in the same calm, unyielding tone. And it means you are now under my protection whether you asked for it or not. The word protection should have felt reassuring, but coming from Vincent Hale, it carried a weight that was impossible to ignore because it did not sound like an offer or a kindness. It sounded like a condition, something that existed whether I accepted it or not. And I stood there trying to understand what it meant to be protected by someone who did not ask permission before deciding anything. I did not ask for that. I said finally, my voice steady but softer than before, because the truth did not need to be loud to be real. Vincent's expression did not change, not in any obvious way, but something in his eyes sharpened, not in annoyance, not even in disagreement, just in recognition, like he had expected that response and had already accounted for it. No, he said simply, and the word carried no judgment, just confirmation. You did not. He let that settle, then added, but that does not change the situation. So what happens now? I asked, and this time there was no hesitation in my voice, no attempt to soften the question, because if I was going to be part of whatever this was, even temporarily, I needed to understand the rules, even if I did not agree with them. Vincent studied me again, his gaze steady, unhurried, and I could feel him measuring not just the question but the way I asked it, the fact that I did not back down, that I did not try to make myself smaller in the moment. Now, he said, his tone calm, controlled, you leave with me. The words landed clearly, without emphasis, but they carried more certainty than anything else that had been said, and I felt my breath catch slightly, not from fear exactly, but from the realization of what that meant. I shook my head slightly before I could stop myself, the instinct to push back rising automatically, because this was too much, too fast, too far from anything I understood. I have a job, I said, and it sounded almost insignificant as soon as it left my mouth, not because it was not true, but because it felt small compared to everything else happening in that room. Not tonight, he replied, and the way he said it made it clear that this was not something he was going to negotiate, not because he did not care, but because in his world, priorities were decided differently, and mine had already been rearranged whether I agreed or not. I hesitated, my mind running through possibilities that did not exist anymore, trying to find a version of this where I could walk away without consequences, but every path I considered led back to the same point, the same realization that he had already made clear. I was visible now, and that visibility came with risks I could not manage on my own. I took a breath, steadying myself, and followed him toward the door, because staying behind no longer felt like the safer option. And as my hand brushed the handle for a brief second before he opened it, I realized that this was not about leaving the restaurant anymore. It was about stepping fully into something I had only touched the edges of before, something that had already begun the moment I chose to speak. And there was no version of this where I could pretend otherwise. The door opened into a quieter part of the building, and the sound of the restaurant faded completely behind us as if it had never existed, replaced by the low hum of distant air conditioning and the soft echo of footsteps that did not belong to a place meant for customers. And for a moment I hesitated just past the threshold, aware that crossing it felt different than anything before, more final, more deliberate, like I was no longer reacting to what had already happened, but choosing to continue into something unknown. Vincent Hale did not look back to see if I followed, and that was what made me move, not pressure, not fear, but the certainty that he did not need to check, that he already knew I would be there. The hallway stretched ahead, lined with muted lighting and clean lines that reflected the same control I had seen in everything connected to him, and I found myself matching his pace without thinking, adjusting to his rhythm the way the room had earlier, the way everything seemed to when he was present. You are quiet, he said after a few seconds, his voice cutting through the silence without breaking it, and I realized he had been aware of me the entire time, not just physically, but in everything else I had not said. I am thinking, I answered, and that felt like the simplest way to say something that was far more complicated than I could explain in a single sentence. He gave a slight nod, not dismissing it, not pressing further, just acknowledging it as enough, and we continued forward until the hallway opened into a private exit I had never seen before, one that bypassed the main entrance entirely. The door led outside, and the night air hit me immediately, cooler than I expected, carrying the faint scent of rain that had slowed but not fully stopped, the city lights reflecting off damp pavement in a way that made everything look sharper, more defined. A black car waited at the curb, engine running quietly, and the driver stepped out the moment Vincent approached, opening the rear door without needing to be asked, his movements efficient and practiced, like this was a routine that had been repeated countless times before. I stopped a few steps short, the reality of what was happening catching up with me again, because stepping into that car felt like more than just leaving the restaurant. It felt like crossing into something that did not have clear boundaries, something that would not end when the night did. Vincent paused then, just briefly, and turned slightly toward me, his attention settling fully on me once more, and there was something in his expression that had not been there earlier, not softer, not exactly, but more defined, like whatever uncertainty had existed at the beginning of the night had been replaced by something clearer, something decided. "You can still walk away," he said, and the words surprised me not because of what they offered, but because of when they were said, not at the beginning, not when I first stepped out of line, but now, after everything had already changed, after I had already been seen, already been placed into something I did not fully understand. I looked at the open car door, then back at him, and for the first time since this started, I considered the possibility of leaving, of turning around and finding my way back to something familiar, something predictable, something safe. But the thought did not settle the way it should have. It felt incomplete, like ignoring something that had already been set in motion. "And if I do not?" I asked, my voice steady despite everything else, because I needed to hear it, needed to understand exactly what staying meant. Vincent held my gaze for a moment, and whatever answer he gave, it was not rushed, not improvised. It was something he had already decided long before I asked the question. "Then you do not go back to being invisible," he said quietly, and there was no threat in it, no promise of anything dramatic, just truth, simple and direct. "You become part of what you chose to step into." I took a breath, steadying myself, and then I moved, stepping forward and sliding into the back seat without looking back, because the moment I had already crossed the line was not when I followed him out of the restaurant. It was when I decided that staying silent was not an option, and everything after that was just the consequence of that truth catching up with me. Vincent closed the door behind me a second later, and as the car pulled away from the curb, the only clear thought left in my mind was that I had not been taken anywhere. I had chosen this, and that made it something far more permanent than I was ready to admit.